Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here, wherever you are in the world. We're broadcasting from London, but it's absolutely marvelous that we can integrate so well with the rest of the world like this. And we've received lots and lots of emails about the way that people say they enjoy these seminars, which makes us really, really pleased. But just to say as well that we now are beginning to hold them again in London in person. And so there will be an opportunity to meet again face to face. Now, the seminar today, of course, continues with our Reviewer Meets Reviewed series, but it's really much more important than that. For those of you who've had the privilege of knowing Professor Hann or knowing his work over the last several decades, will know, of course, that he is a leading ethnographer of Hungary, of Poland, of Turkey, and other parts of the world, including the Uyghurs, conducted with his wife Ildiko Belohan. But more than that, he has made a fundamental contribution to our understanding of post-socialist societies. And he's done through an endless stream of articles, of distinguished lectures, of books, of edited volumes, as well as making an immense practical contribution through his work in Cambridge, in Kent, where he was chair of anthropology, and then, of course, as the founding director of the Max Planck Institute in Halle. But what's so fascinating about all this is what drives somebody like that when they're doing fieldwork in diverse parts of the world, when they're writing many disparate papers. What is, as it were, the intellectual machinery which stimulates them and helps them synthesize, helps them interact in all these diverse backgrounds? And one of the things here, I think, is the work of Polanyi for Professor Hann. So what we're seeing here is not, as it were, just a collection of essays, important though that is, but we're seeing a stream of thought, a writing out of ideas which have been absolutely fundamental for the way that he has developed his intellectual perspective over such a long and fruitful and indeed famous career. So I think we're greatly privileged to have the chance to ask him whether my assessment is true in the chat later, or by putting in your questions and asking your questions live, and really trying to get to the heart of what makes an anthropologist take a particular perspective in their research, and what is it they find stimulating about concentrating on a particular author. I just have to, before we move on, just to say one tiny thing, which is very unfortunate because of a family complication. I will have to leave at 5:30, but please just carry on. I mean no discourtesy, and I offer my apologies, and we will continue, I hope. And of course, the other person we need to introduce today is Professor James Carrier, also very well known as an economic anthropologist. He's kindly been with the RA in some of these sessions before. I've known James for many years myself, and he of course has many colleagues, and he's known as being a man of remarkable intelligence and incisive wit. And I really hope that he brings some of that to our discussion today. Well, that's quite enough from me. Now we pass it over to Professor Hann, who will, for the first part of our seminar, outline what he was doing in this book. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, David, for this hyperbole. It can only go downhill from this point, I'm afraid. I must thank the RAI for organizing this event, and above all, I thank James Carrier for his careful, detailed review that appeared some time ago in the Institute's journal. I appreciate this review all the more in that James Carrier is not a regional expert on the part of the world that this book deals with. Most of the book is nitty-gritty ethnographic material from Eastern Europe, especially Hungary and Poland. And to the best of my knowledge, James, although he has a lot of regional expertise, it does not include those countries. It does not really include the post-socialist world and the socialist world that preceded it. So I'm very glad that a distinguished economic anthropologist agreed to review this work, because of course that was my other goal in publishing this book, to address wider audiences and not just area studies. There is another element in the book, which I'll just mention in a sentence. It comes at the very end, chapter 12, which is about Eurasia. And this is a concept that I've played with a lot in the last 10 or 20 years. Most of my colleagues and friends think it's rather far-fetched, and so perhaps it's just as well that James was silent about this idea in his review. For me, it remains of enormous importance, in spite of increasingly authoritarian rule in China and Russian invasion of Ukraine and other horrible things going on across the Eurasian landmass. In some ways, because of these tragic developments, I think we should hold on to some notion of unity in diversity across Eurasia, the old world of Eurasia. We should be suspicious of a renewal of Atlanticism under the hegemony of Washington. But these elements only crop up, and then in very diluted form, in chapter 12. Please remember, this book was really finished a good 5 years ago. It was sent to the publisher in 2017. So I think it's best if we set those topical political questions aside this afternoon. But of course, if anybody wants to get back to them in the discussion, I'll be more than happy to do so. I would also suggest that we set aside pretty much everything in the second half of the book, where James, in his review, accurately reports my deep skepticism concerning the concept of civil society. That's a topic I'm continuing to look at empirically in ongoing projects in provincial Hungary. He also reports my documentation going back to the 1990s of increasing ethno-national sentiments, tensions in particular in Southeast Poland, an alleged civilizational divide between Western and Eastern Christianity in that part of Europe. Several chapters do indeed deal with these phenomena, and I think James has got it right. I see these phenomena as intimately connected with the demise of socialist rule and thus with changes in an economic order. But I think it makes sense today, given limitations on time, to restrict the focus to economy, which basically means the first 5 chapters of the book. I can wave the book at people here if some of you haven't seen it, haven't got hands on a copy. In terms of summarizing its content, I looked at the publisher's blurbs today again for the first time in a couple of years, and there's nothing I'd really wish to change there. And James gets it right. And I'm going to talk about the first 5 chapters and occasional references to chapter 11, the penultimate chapter of the book. So that's what I will do in the next 20 minutes or so. Now, the chapters deal with issues that qualify as economic in rather obvious ways. For example, they pertain to markets, or they pertain to the ownership of land, property, or they are about other forms of property in our ultra commoditized digital age. I talk a little bit about production, in particular with reference to households, usually characterized as peasant, and the place that these people occupy in changing class structures across not just East European, Eurasian societies more generally after decollectivization. So the themes are economic, and the chapters were written over a period of some 25 years between the early 1990s and 2017, when I finalized this manuscript. Chapter 11 is the only one that was written in that year, 2017. And that reports on recent research in Viktor Orban's Hungary, more specifically in a market town in the south of that country near the Serbian border. Yeah, so that's where I get on to some fresh stuff. The rest of it, chapter 4 was previously published in Socioeconomic Review, which is a journal that's better known, I think, to economic sociologists than to anthropologists. Chapters 2, 3, and 5 are amalgams of papers and chapters that I published previously, but brought together in a definitive version in this book. Now, I have to say, it was actually more hard work to collate these materials, to combine elements from different earlier publications than it might have been to start again and write fresh papers. But I felt obliged to look at some of my older stuff, correct some interpretations where necessary, even some factual details, knock the arguments into shape as best I could for a publication in hardcovers that might last a little bit longer than ephemeral journal publications, internet publications. So that's what I've done. And in chapter 3, it's only chapter 3 where it's a matter of tracing processes of transformation through time in one and the same location. The other amalgams look at different locations in the same chapter, different countries. Chapter 3 is the longest one, 40 pages, and I suppose it's the nearest I have ever come so far to a definitive updating of the monograph that I published on a Hungarian village. The village is called Tázlár, some of you might have heard of it. That was my PhD work in the 1970s, and the monograph came out in 1980, a very long time ago. Nowadays, this village, which I still visit quite frequently, I was there this summer just for a short visit. I spend more time in the nearby market town in recent years. But both the village and the market town vote overwhelmingly for Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party. And one of the reasons I keep going back to this region is to try to understand the social roots of the new one-party system that some people describe as a populist hegemony that Hungary has, certainly rural Hungary has today. No other party gets a look in the countryside. Fidesz is dominant. I find the work of Karl Polanyi helpful to frame all of these materials. I think Polanyi offers a vision that enables me to link very micro level research, visiting the same families again and again in one small village. That micro work has to be tied to the larger questions of countries and blocks, regions, and then ultimately I get up to this level of Eurasia, which I'm not going to engage with. Ultimately, I suppose planetary futures are involved here, and we can certainly talk about that scale as well, if anyone wishes to. I'm not even afraid to use the concept of the Anthropocene if anybody wants to bring it in later, because I think Polanyi has insights into these fundamental issues that matter for the future of our planet. But in the rest of my time, I'm not going to talk about the planet. I'm not going to talk about Eurasia. I need to start, I think, by saying a bit more about Polanyi himself and why I find his vision important for economic anthropology, which is where I anticipate James taking up the story, given all his expertise and all the contributions that he himself has made to this field or subfield or discipline, subdiscipline. Keith Hart and I have argued in the past that economic anthropology deserves full recognition as a discipline, not just a marginal interface between two established disciplines, but it could be taken more seriously in syllabi, at least as seriously as economic sociology is. So perhaps the status of economic anthropology is one topic that we can get back to in our discussion. Karl Polanyi, born in Vienna, 1886. For those of you who'd like to place him in an anthropological genealogy, that's 2 years after Malinowski's birth in Krakow, a city of the same Austro-Hungarian Empire, needless to say. Though born in Vienna, Polanyi is raised in Budapest. He's the son of a wealthy Jewish family that experiences hard times when his father's business fails at the turn of the century. Polanyi himself is a brilliant student. He serves his emperor on the Eastern Front and experiences trauma at the end of the First World War. He spends most of the rest of his life in exile, first of all in Austria, then on to Britain when it was no longer safe to stay in Austria, and then finally, after the Second World War, in North America. These were the successive stages of Polanyi's migration. And I talk a little bit about his life and his work briefly in chapter 1. His standing in economic anthropology is based on the magnum opus. All the Polanyi scholars agree that the book titled The Great Transformation, published in 1944, is the work that stands out far above everything else he did. But there are also key essays, programmatic essays that he published in a volume he co-edited. 1957 is the date of these. After that, there's not a great deal that's published. He was old, he was sick, and he died at his home in Ontario in 1964. The reception of his work by anthropologists really took off only after his death. It was mediated primarily by one of his students, a scholar called George Dalton, trained originally in economics. And the substantivist school, as shaped by Dalton in particular, was presented in the 1960s and to generations of students thereafter, as an alternative paradigm to that of mainstream, so-called neoclassical economics. A paradigm, a substantivist paradigm, was one that did justice to the embeddedness of economy in the rest of social life. It was therefore more compatible with a cultural anthropology that emphasized human diversity rather than universally valid rational calculation to maximize utility. These were the assumptions of the main competing paradigm. The formalist paradigm, drawing on mainstream economics, was also very important for debates in anthropology. And these were the polemics that we were taught when we took anthropology courses in the 60s and into the early 70s, when I came into anthropology as a graduate student. By this time, a new paradigm had already appeared on the scene from the late 1960s. It can loosely be described as neo-Marxist. It was shaped particularly by French scholars, inspired by a philosopher called Althusser. And I was trying to make sense of these neo-Marxist currents when I went off to Hungary in 1975 to start doctoral fieldwork. And basically I failed. As anyone who reads chapter 1 of this book will quickly see, I'm not ashamed to admit it. Well, I am ashamed in a way. It's really a rather embarrassing story because in retrospect, it would not have been difficult to theorize what I found in that Hungarian village and in the trajectory of Hungarian market socialist economy more generally. I could have theorized it in terms of what some of the neo-Marxists were saying about the articulation of modes of production, in particular, the articulation of a household-based, some people said peasant mode of production, with what the socialists were doing in terms of collectivization, establishing new large-scale institutions in agriculture and in industry. I didn't do this. I didn't really develop much of a theoretical angle at all. I stepped back from theory in horror. And Polanyi, unfortunately, is really not mentioned either in my dissertation, Cambridge 1979, or in the monograph that I published a year later. As I say, I'm embarrassed. The only best explanation I can give you is that by the later 1970s, quite apart from my own trouble in making sense of field data and being immersed in ethnography, but Polanyi's star had faded, as so often happens in our academic debates. Somebody who is cutting edge throughout one decade, then has to drop out of sight for a while. I'm not suggesting that Polanyi ever disappeared altogether from public debates, scholarly debates in our discipline and in other fields, but he was not prominent, not cited either by formalist economic anthropologists sympathetic to Sir Raymond Firth, perhaps, or by the neo-Marxists, people like Godelier and in this country, Maurice Bloch. For them, Polanyi was talking about exchange and modes of transaction, and what he had to offer didn't get to grips with production at all. And so we didn't need to cite him. He rather faded away. And I'm ashamed to say that he's not present in my work from that period. When I was teaching economic anthropology to students in Cambridge and Canterbury, I went over the basics of what the formalists had to say about the substantivists and vice versa. But I think at that time, before the centenary of Polanyi's birth came around in 1986, until then, I was not really familiar with his biography. I didn't know that he had roots in socialist theorizing. I didn't know that he was married to Ilona Duchinska, who was a passionate revolutionary in Hungary in 1919 and remained a loyal member of the Communist Party thereafter. Polanyi did not join the Communist Party, to my knowledge. He was never a card-carrying member, and he distanced himself from Marx in numerous ways, in numerous publications. I think you should classify Polanyi's socialism as closer to the philosophical inspiration of a Rousseau or of some utopian socialists, and conceivably in our own era, perhaps David Graeber. We can talk about all of these names later. But there's no doubt he was a man of the left, as highlighted by Gareth Dale in the biography published in 2016. And I recommend this biography and also Dale's introductory volume of 2010 and several later edited volumes containing early articles and later materials by Polanyi himself on diverse subjects. Polanyi was not afraid to tackle a vast range of topics from the ancient Greeks to the rise of fascism. And it's been fascinating for me to discover a lot of this little known work in recent decades. Really from 1986 onwards, it's been a process of discovery, but there was much more to Polanyi than what the anthropologists were exposed to in the 1960s and the 1970s. So when Keith Hart and I convened an international conference at the Max Planck Institute, Social Anthropology in Halle, in 2005, I think it was, and James Carrier was present, it seemed very natural to revisit Polanyi at this time, given what was happening in the real world economies around us. Under the title, The Great Transformation Today, we tried to assess the pertinence of Polanyi's critique of Victorian, laissez-faire economics for the rise of a new liberal order in our time, neoliberalism, as it's commonly called, the origins of which you can trace to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and if you want to go back a little further, to the breakdown of Keynesian economics in the 1970s. Neoliberalism, in my understanding, and of course this is a shorthand for a lot of very complex phenomena which have a lot to do with the acceleration of globalization trends. These are all big terms that we can get into in the discussion if you wish to. But for me, it's important to see an acceleration that's related to the disintegration of the Soviet bloc in the early 1990s, the absence of any alternative model to that of so-called liberal, pluralist societies, market-driven economies. Hungary in the 1990s did not experience quite the same shock therapy from the neoliberals as Poland did, but the consequences of the new capitalism over the next 20 years in Hungary were really quite similar to those experienced throughout the region. A market principle, which was present in Hungary from 1968 onwards, Hungary went further than any country in the Soviet bloc in terms of reforming central planning. The so-called new economic mechanism introduced in January 1968 went a long way to decentralize decision-taking, to provide material incentives for more efficient decision-taking and pricing. All of this brought elements of the market into an economy in which you could say that redistribution, another key concept for Polanyi, redistribution as a form of integration remained dominant over the other concepts that Polanyi offers, reciprocity, market exchange being the key concepts. You'll all be familiar, most of you I think will be familiar with the metaphor of disembedding. It's a misleading metaphor perhaps, because just like Polanyi's analysis of Victorian liberalism, you have to come to terms with a lot of institutional context, socio-cultural context. The state is crucial for creating the conditions for market domination. Things don't happen in a vacuum in the societies that we study in the real world. But I don't want to quibble over this metaphor of embedding and disembedding. We can certainly talk about that. But I find the general analysis of Polanyi spot on for identifying what has been happening in Eastern and Central Europe in the post-socialist decades. There were differences, of course, from what happened in Victorian Britain. The new order was introduced under the leadership of politicians, some of them conventionally associated with the left, Clinton in North America, Tony Blair in Britain, and they have their epigones in Eastern Europe. Tony Blair was the model for a Hungarian politician called Ferenc Gyurcsány, who held power for much of the 2010s and led the country into the mess from which Viktor Orban claims to have extracted it. New levels of governance certainly need to be taken into account. If you compare neoliberalism with the original Victorian liberalism, for example, you need to take account of the EU and the transfer income that Orban is able to redistribute. Note the Polanyi term again, redistribution doesn't just mean redistributing what you can collect through taxation in one national economy. It nowadays also involves the redistribution of national income from outside, from the Brussels Commission, although that is currently in question because of the dire situation of law and order, political competition in Hungary. These are again issues we can certainly go into later in the discussion. This neoliberalism, as promoted partly by nominally left-leaning politicians around the turn of the century, could not last, and it did not last. There was a global crisis, structural crisis of capitalism around most of the world. And from about the same time, you can see Hungary and Poland, the subject of my book, structurally, again, on the periphery of North Atlantic dominated capitalism. It was the condition from which socialism had sought to liberate them in the 1940s and the 1950s, when those countries became socialist. 4 decades did not bring much liberation. Nowadays, Hungary is again providing cheap labor, nowadays for German car makers with huge factories inside Hungary, or it's exporting the labor, human labor classified by Polanyi as a fictitious commodity. Labor is a fictitious commodity because human beings are not produced for sale on a market. This is perversely what our way of organizing the economy has done with labor and with land as well, which has been largely privatized, and supporters, cronies of Orban himself and his family have done very well out of these privatization campaigns. Labor is exported to countries like Britain, where Hungarians fill gaps everywhere in our labor market, from the London ambulance service and dentists. I did have personal experience of a Hungarian dentist in Cambridge just very recently. It was very positive, but I can't help thinking, whenever this happens to me, why is it so difficult for this wealthy country to train enough doctors and train enough dentists so that we don't have to have these forms of neocolonialism? Well-trained specialists in Hungary can be lured to this country, and it's indeed seen as a very good thing, as progressive by some who think they're on the left in this country, to open the doors to migration of this kind. Of course, many Hungarians are also coming for unskilled jobs. They are making the beds and washing the dishes in Cambridge colleges. And you will all, I'm sure, have many more examples of what I'm talking about here. Karl Polanyi would not be surprised that these developments, this hyper-marketization, but land and labor, that's what he liked to concentrate on, money as well, we can bring that into the picture. Polanyi would not be surprised at the reaction, the backlash, the populist or illiberal turn that these countries have taken in recent years as a result of the new disembedding. His concept of a double movement, sometimes phrased in terms of a counter movement to the atomizing havoc of the spread of a market principle. That's what we're talking about here. Counter movements can be benign, as when trade unions were established in the 19th century by workers getting together to form associations to improve their own conditions. And you can have an argument about whether institutions such as trade unions, which work within the framework of a capitalist order, which they help to make viable, to save from further crises perhaps, while improving the position of workers within the order, are these strengthening capitalism in the long term? Well, we can argue about the functionalist implications of some of Polanyi's theorizing in that regard. The other scenario is when the counter movement is not so benign, and social cohesion is the pretext for unscrupulous populist politicians to interfere with market logic in arbitrary ways, just to cement their own hold on power, to help to form a new national bourgeoisie that will be docile and help to fund one dominant party. This is what's going on in Hungary these days. I broadly follow the analysis of the sociologist Gábor Scheiring, whose book came out in 2020, I think, 21. And I've enjoyed cooperating with Gábor, most recently on a special issue of the journal Europe-Asia Studies. It came out at the end of last year, devoted to counter movements, not just in Hungary, but also in the other countries of the Visegrád cooperation in Central Europe. And there's one chapter also on Eastern Germany, former socialist parts of Germany. So I think my half hour is coming to an end, and I'd better conclude. I will conclude by returning to economic anthropology. as Keith Hart and I argued at the end of our primer a decade ago, and also in the edited volume that emerged from the conference, we think that Polanyi deserves to be recognized alongside Marcel Mauss, who is a contemporary, of course, and a left-leaning, non-Marxist socialist contemporary. We see Polanyi and Mauss as key figures, giants in the history of economic anthropology. Their vision of democratic socialist alternatives to a capitalist order should be capable of enthusing the students that we teach in our courses. I think the story of how Eastern Europe has been transformed, first of all by socialism and then by post-socialism, meaning neoliberal capitalism. This is a great laboratory in which to study some pretty awful experiments in human history using anthropological ethnographic methods. And that's what I tried to do in this book. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris, for an absolutely fascinating introduction, really enthralling. And now we have to pass over to James Carrier, please. The floor is yours, James.
Thank you. Repatriating Polanyi declares its focus in its title. That is, applying the ideas of Karl Polanyi to Central Europe. Polanyi was born, as Chris said, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So applying his work to that part of the world is a kind of repatriation. I am, however, no specialist on Central Europe. So here I focus instead on a more general thought that came to mind as I was mulling over what I might say about Chris's book. It comes in two parts. I'll present those parts in turn and then pose the question that I think those two parts raise. Once I've done that, I'll ask Chris his thoughts about that question, and that'll give him a chance to tell me where I've gone wrong about what's in his book. So, the first part of that thought. From what's in the book, it appears that if we want to try to bring about a world in which people can lead reasonably comfortable and happy lives, we should pay attention to the concrete contingencies that we confront in the world and not simply embrace abstract principles. So, Hann says that when he first went into the field in Hungary in the 1970s, the Hungarian government embraced Marxist-Leninist socialism, but when they came to apply it to places like his field site, the village of Tazla, they applied that socialism in light of the concrete circumstances of those places. The result was what Hann calls pragmatic market socialism, and he says it worked pretty well. Also from what's in the book, it appears that if we want to try to learn about the world, or at least do good anthropology, we also need to attend to concrete circumstances. That is, Chris invokes people like Malinowski with his long-term research that attends to the particularities of people's lives. However, Hann says we need more than this. That is, we need to think of those particularities in terms of broader conceptual frames. This is, of course, not a novel view of anthropology. Back in 1952, Radcliffe Brown said the discipline relies on two things. One is what he called ethnography, the description of what the researcher observes in the field. In other words, the ideographic, the more concrete in particular. The other is what he called comparative sociology, the development of reasonably valid generalizations about and understandings of social life in a range of situations and settings. In other words, the nomothetic, the more abstract and general. So, pardon me, just as good Hungarian government rested on the conjunction of abstract principles and concrete practicality, it's also the case that good Malinowskian anthropology rests on the conjunction of the concrete lives of people in the field and the abstract generalities that are the analytical apparatus of the discipline. I want now to point to a third thing in Hann's book, Polanyi's substantivist approach to economy, together with Hann's view of economic anthropology. Hann says that Polanyi was, and I quote, concerned to understand how the economy was bound to society, to values and identities, and to human flourishing. In line with this, Chris says that economic anthropology has, and I quote again, an expansive agenda based on a holistic, materialist understanding of the embedded human economy. In this, Polanyi rejected what he called the formalist view of economy, which Chris has mentioned. That is, the view that, at heart, economy should be seen as a result of a mass of individual decision-making, particularly people allocating their scarce resources among alternative ends to maximize their utility. Fortuitously, fairly recently, I reread T.B. Baltimore's Karl Marx Early Writings. That's translations of things that Marx wrote before 1845. Also, I've been reading about early British political economists. What Hann says looks like a lot like what those early writers were trying to do. Like Polanyi, they seem to have held that we need to attend to the practices and social arrangements that are found in the production and circulation of things that satisfy human needs. And further, we need to see how those practices and arrangements, and indeed those needs, are influenced by people's beliefs, values, social relationships, and the rest, just as we need to attend to how those beliefs, values, and the rest are related to people's economic practices and arrangements. Let me try to summarize the thread that runs through the things I've said about Hann's book. An adequate approach to things in the world is to see them both in terms of their concrete particularities and in terms of a broader conceptual apparatus. So we want something like pragmatic market socialism, which combines a set of principles with attention to practical, social, and economic arrangements in places like Tesla. We want research that combines careful attention to the details of people's lives with awareness of the broader intellectual apparatus of the discipline. And we need to approach people's economic activities in terms of the broader and more general social, cultural, and political context in which they exist. I don't think that what I say here is particularly contentious. After all, it's simply the point that we should approach the particular with broader issues in mind, and that we should apply those broader ideas and principles in ways that take account of the particularities of what we confront. I said that the thought that came to my mind from the book has two parts, and I've laid out the first part. Now, and much more briefly, I turn to the second. If what I've said is a reasonable interpretation of the arguments in the book, and if it's a plausible guide for action, we get to a question. Why does this idea that we ought to attend to both the abstract and the concrete, the particular and the general, the thing and its context, so seem to be on the losing side so often? Consider, for instance, firstly, pragmatic market socialism was swept aside. What seems to have occupied the high ground in that and related conflicts in many of the former Comecon countries was the principles of the Department of Economics of the University of Chicago. In extreme form, this was called shock therapy, the abrupt and wholesale elimination of state regulation of economic activity and of state support for economic actors. Secondly, among many anthropologists, the mix of detailed ethnography and attention to broader analytical questions seems to have disappeared in favor of intensely local views. Indeed, often the prime focus of attention seems to be the detailed exposition of the local. Often that's justified by the claim that a concern with those broader analytical questions and how they relate to what researchers observe in the field amounts to a political act through which anthropologists, creatures of colonialist Western modernity, dominate others. Or, in the interesting and prejudicial words of Patricia Spire, we should reject, and I quote, any attempt to domesticate such otherness by either explaining it away or reducing it to something already known and commonsensical. Of course, Spire is not the first to take this view. Almost 40 years before she wrote those words, Clifford Geertz, in his deep play, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight, said that his anthropological approach allows, and I quote, the possibility for an analysis which attends to the substance of symbolic expressions like the cockfight, rather than, and note his prejudicial language, reductive formulas professing to account for. Such statements led one sympathetic commentator to say that Geertz looks rather like someone who, and I quote, endorses a particularist approach to cultural analysis while eschewing explanation and generalization. Finally, I've said that Polanyi's view of economic anthropology, as well as Hann, resembles the work of the young Marx and early British political economists. However, by the last third of the 19th century, all that had been swept aside. They were displaced by marginalist microeconomics, which focus on individuals seeking to gain the greatest utility by rationally allocating their limited resources as they choose amongst alternative ends and without a context in sight. The thought that came to mind when I was wrestling with what's in the book are not very cheery, nor the question they lead to. And the question for Chris, if attention to both the abstract and the concrete, the general and the particular is so beneficial, why do people so often seem to embrace either an abstract principle fervently or to reject anything that looks like one? Chris? You're mute, probably wisely.
Yeah, just give me a chance to get my head around these thoughts. Thank you very much, James. My very first thought, this is not disrespectful at all, it's because you have not lost your American accent completely after all these decades of living on this side of the ocean. So the phrase that comes to my mind when I hear you talking about the need to combine the concrete and the motherhood, apple pie, I mean, this really is common ground, I think, not contentious, as you say. Yeah. As a scholarly discipline, I will say bravely, yes, that is what we should be doing. Let me just pick up on some of the connections that you made. I don't think I can grapple with them all, but I'm obviously sympathetic to almost everything, and perhaps just ignorant when I'm not sympathetic. My own training here in Cambridge, Jack Goody was my supervisor. Radcliffe Brown was a figure hovering in the background, definitely not fashionable by the 1970s, but the idea of a comparative social science. Jack Goody, for those of you who don't know the man, it's still worth looking him up, I think, although his star has sunk in pretty much the same way, according to the same pattern that Polanyi's star faded after his death. Goody didn't really like to associate with the anthropologists who dominated the discipline by the end of the last century, and preferred to be a member of the sociology section at the British Academy because the sociologists still, he thought, had old-fashioned ideas about the value of generalization and comparison, which had been lost by most of his anthropological colleagues. Goody was succeeded in Cambridge by Ernest Gellner, another very unusual figure in the modern history of the discipline. Let me stress, both of these individuals did nitty-gritty ethnographic research, as I called it. They grappled with the concrete in James Carrier's sense. But most of their later publications, after the field work was completed, they didn't go back again and again to the same boring village. They did much more serious, comparative, analytic work. And that's why they are still worth reading, in my view, for generations of scholars. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm with Radcliffe Brown and Jack Goody and Ernest Gellner. But I wouldn't be dismissive. There was a slight hint, because you picked on Clifford Geertz, and even Clifford Geertz, let's not forget, whatever you think about the doors that he opened to later extreme culturalist trends that may or may not have reached their peak in the current debates about coloniality, post-coloniality. I do see a trend here. Ernest Gellner used to label it postmodernism, although you, I think, carefully avoided that particular ism. But these trends have influenced a lot of work in economic anthropology. I tend to deplore them, but let's not forget that Geertz liked to compare markets in different parts of the world, the Islamic world that he specialized in. He may not have explained according to the rigorous criteria of a Radcliffe Brownian social scientist, but you can get a lot of very stimulating material. You find it there in the ethnographies that Clifford Geertz worked, and in ethnographies of the kind that he supported. He was still trying to understand a real world of economics, even when devoting more time and energy as he got older to the symbols, the webs of meaning. But there was a real economy as well, I think, for Geertz. Where are we today in economic anthropology? Let me first of all just throw in a quick note. You said you went back to Tom Bottomore on the early Marx, but not everyone in the audience may be aware that those writings were not known, I think, until the late 1920s, early 1930s, when they were published for the first time. And when Polanyi got hold of them, this is some years after he's been reading the orthodox texts of the Marxist Lenin, of historical materialism, which did not appeal to Polanyi because of their scientific, positivistic, evolutionist, all of the he called it a form of economic determinism. And I think you can see what he means in the way that Engels formalized Marxist approaches after Marx's death, partly. But the discovery of the early writings of a humanist Marx, who is closer to Jean-Jacques Rousseau than to those who dominated the Marxist tradition after the deaths of both Marx and Engels. This was inspiring for Polanyi, and that's why there is a lot of common ground between what Marx has to say about the human spirit, about commodity fetishism, for example, that lingers on in his analysis of Capital. That's what appeals to Polanyi, and not the extreme positivist, evolutionist thinking of Soviet-style historical materialism. That was just a digression here. I appreciate your mention of human flourishing. It's the Aristotelian echo. That phrase, I think, is translation of a Greek original that I don't remember today. But the tradition that goes back to, yeah, let's be quite crude about this, an anti-market sentiment, self-sufficiency. The project that Steve Goodman and I organized in the later years of the Max Planck Institute, devoted to self-sufficiency at household level, or at least the aspiration to self-sufficiency in post-socialist conditions. That was so important, and there are intellectual connections there that we try to make with Stephen's inspiration, I stress, from the ethnography of households to some extent forced to be more self-sufficient because of post-socialist disruption, because they were in trouble as a result of shock therapy. What did they do? They responded by going back to older ideals of building a life for themselves in the world that they could control in their families and households, and human flourishing, not relying on the market whenever you can possibly avoid those external dependencies. Thank you for raising that theme. And thank you, I think at the end, you were asking several things, and I want to raise one issue which some readers of the book will pick up on. I didn't mention it now in my presentation this afternoon, but it is in a sense the major, yeah, I'll use the word ethical problem that I've had to face almost from the very beginning. Because although I do indeed see the reformed Hungarian economy of the 1970s and 1980s in rather positive terms, I don't romanticize it. There were all sorts of problems. There were pathologies in the village, alcoholism, suicide rates, divorce rates, a lot of things that we might not find so attractive were also happening, and social differentiation was increasing after the forced leveling of the Stalinist period. So there was a lot going on in this. I refer to it nowadays as the mixed socialist economy, socialist mixed economy. That phrase, market socialism, has it's acquired so much freight. There is such a large literature there that I tend to avoid that particular phrase now, but we can talk about that as well if you like. The mixed socialist economy that introduced elements of market and competition, response to market signals, price mechanisms. All of that was still subordinated to socialist principles in the sense that the means of production, almost everything that was produced industrially, and the land, these were in collective, not necessarily ownership if you pay attention to legal title, but certainly collective control. So it was a mixture, a hybrid, with redistribution dominating over the principle of market exchange. We have a hybrid in Hungary today, which is market exchange dominating over very corrupt forms of redistribution organized by Orban and his crony politics inside the Fidesz party, and to some extent outside it. But the ethical issue turns on this. My analysis of flexible adaptation, compromises, of dogma, of socialist abstractions in order to let people get on with their lives and build the kind of houses that they wanted to, and even import foreign cars if they could get the resources to do so. A lot of flexibility in the older models of socialism. I thought all of that was a good thing, but most of the people I was living with in that Hungarian village in the 1970s thought that socialism could not be saved. They were inveterate anti-socialists, and there was really nothing that could be done by way of reform in Budapest, only a couple of hours away, 120 kilometers away. When they had a chance to vote in democratic elections, they did not vote socialist. They voted for a smallholders party, which had been their party in the 1940s until it was repressed. And they continued to vote for conservative, right-of-center solutions. They wanted privatization of land and just about everything else. They're cooperative. It took a long time to disintegrate, as I document in the book, but it did finally disappear. In other words, if the anthropologist has an obligation to sympathize, even empathize with the people that he is studying, and I certainly have tried to do that, and I don't find it difficult to do that with the people that I continue to visit, but there is always this, you can refer to it as an ideological problem if you wish, another term we can get to in the discussion, their own values, the emphasis placed on the private ownership of land, the private marketing, private business spirit, all of this is extremely strong in Hungary. And that goes against the grain of my external academic analysis, my comparisons with other socialist countries and with countries in the West where populist parties are also popular. So my intellectual games as a comparativist and a social scientist take me away from that deeper exploration of why the Hungarian villagers have the worldviews that they have and the values that they have. And I have several times been in danger of claiming to know what was good for them better than they could recognize themselves. It's not a point, I'm not the first to have this kind of dilemma, but I thought I would throw it in case anyone else would like to talk about that today. Finally, a word about economic anthropology, since I thought this would be the main focus, and you've given some indications already. I'm not going to start naming names and all the people who I think are doing great work. Lots of people are doing great work. I would just like to say that looking back on those polemics between formalist and substantivist and the Marxists and the more Geertzian culturalist approaches, I see some value in just about everything. There is almost nothing I would wish to exclude from a broad church understanding. I've debated this a lot over the years with the likes of Keith Hart and Stephen Goodman. No idea if they are about just now, if they are online. I haven't looked at the list, but I have my preferences, but I am open to, for example, the successors of the formalist school in the guise of new institutionalist economics. Very often comes down to a somewhat reductionist interpretation of economic phenomena. I use that word carefully. I think Stephen Goodman would agree with me on that and insist on a more culturalist interpretation of some phenomena that new institutionalists reduce to the logic of rational utility maximization, ultimately resource allocation. For me, there is space for intelligent new institutionalism. There is space for the kind of economics that behavioral economists do, for experiments in the field to test certain hypotheses about human nature. This kind of work is going on at the interface between anthropology and psychology. It's not what I do. It's not what I would supervise students to do, but I think it has its place. Even more macroeconomic, econometric model building with lots of statistics may have a place. I would not rule it out. I'm eclectic. Economic anthropology should be a broad church, but my position today is that the inspiration and the willingness to draw more generally on social science theory, in Polanyi's case, it would be a German tradition. There is more than a nod to Max Weber as well as to Marx. In the case of Mauss, it would be to Durkheim, of course, and a distinctive French tradition of theorizing. Combining social science theory with micro-level ethnography, I think, is the key to the vitality of our field. That's what I would like to say at this point. That was my second burst, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long. Back to you, James.
No, I was as much interested to hear your thoughts as one of the things that, to go back to Geertz for a moment, one of the questions is the difference between what Geertz said and what everybody read. And people didn't read Nagara or Peddlers and Princes. Pardon me. Peddlers and Princes. They read the Balinese Cockfight. So the more nuanced approach that you advocate is fine in principle. I don't see it working out in practice. So, like I said, what Geertz wrote, I'm no specialist in Geertz, but I read what's his book on cultural anthropology? I can't remember the name of it now. And everybody of a generation read Notes on the Balinese Cockfight. And that may very well have been the only Geertz that they read. So I'm drawing a distinction between what is out there that we might approach and what people seem to be actually paying attention to. Does that distinction make a difference? You're muted. Hello, hello. You're muted. There we go.
Absolutely. Samuel Williams is doing great work to recover the Geertzian contributions to economic anthropology. And I think there is material worth recovering from the early work in Indonesia, as well as from the later study of markets in Morocco. And the politics of his research and his methods, we can argue about all those fine details, but I'm totally in agreement with your general point there.
We are more or less past our allotted hour, I think. Do we want to deal with, do we have somebody from the RAI to tell us what we ought to be doing next?
Well, I think as we didn't start till 8 minutes past, don't stop yourself up in mid-flow. If you've got a couple more brief things you'd like to say, go ahead. This is so absolutely fascinating. We have a couple of questions. So why don't you make the point you'd like to make, James?
No, I've more or less shot my, I've got another, you have another half an hour? No, you don't.
All right. Well, well, in that case, we've got a question here from, give me for the pronunciation, from Jens. I won't try and pronounce your surname, Jens. I'm sorry, I'll only embarrass myself. But would you like to ask your question live, or would you like Chris just to look at the chat, or I'll read it out? If you would like to, just raise your hand, and then Henning will go straight for you. So wait for a second to see, Jens, if your hand goes up. No, all right, then we'll go to your written question then, Jens. So Jens would say, asks, Chris, you mentioned those of Marx's writings available to Karl Polanyi in the 1920s didn't appeal to Polanyi because they were evolutionist. But Jens says, my understanding of the Great Transformation certainly has an evolutionist undercurrent too, reflected in the book's title even. Do you disagree with his assessment, or do I misunderstand your point about evolutionism here?
Thank you for the question. My understanding is that in the Great Transformation is the big volume that leads most of the scholarly communities that I know to classify Polanyi as an economic historian. I try to avoid that. He's a polymath who dabbled in many fields, and I recommend Gareth Dale's coverage for the full complexity. He's not a card-carrying anthropologist, never was, never worked in an anthropology department, never did field work, although some historical studies might have qualified as historical anthropology. But the Great Transformation is a work of history, very meticulous examination of 19th century British economic history. And the chapters that interest the anthropologists, chapters 4, 5, and 6, if I remember correctly, you may well say there is an implicit evolutionism there, but he is careful to avoid the kind of dialectical model that he was well familiar with from the German language theoretical debates from the 19th century as to how codified in the early Soviet Union, how from an original primitive communism, the class conflict had pushed human society forwards, this notion of progress, a teleology that was fundamental to the Marxist hope in building a communist future. After all, if we have been communist once in the past with hunter-gatherers, then we can get back to the classless society in the future. and we can analyze rigorously how this happens through various stages. Polanyi did not endorse that kind of thinking at all. Stages play no significant role in, or any later, any more Darwinian kind of evolutionary argument. I say no, Polanyi, although you can look at his work and you may say that his key ideal types of reciprocity and redistribution, the way he presents them, there is an implicit evolutionism there, because reciprocity is illustrated with regard to societies that lack central power, and so they are naturally somehow simpler technologically than the hierarchical societies that followed them. But no, not an evolutionist in the sense that so many other scholars of his age were bought into various kinds of evolutionism in more rigorous ways. Polanyi avoids that.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you very much. And Professor Eriksson also asked a question. Thomas, would you like to come on live? It's always very nice to have the chance to say hello. Please do if you would like to. Would you like to highlight Professor Eriksson, Henning?
Well, he hasn't put up his hand, so please, if you would like to speak, just use the, yeah, he has, okay.
There we are.
Because otherwise we won't force you to speak, of course, but we can allow you to speak now if you unmute.
Great. So thank you. Thanks very much, both. This is fascinating. So I've got a very specific question for Chris, because since you've directed research on religion and economy, a major project on the, inspired to a great extent by Weber's sociology of religion, to what extent could religion play a part in the anti-socialists we've encountered in Hungary? Now, I'm also, like James, I'm not a regional specialist, but I happen to know that Roman Catholicism is the largest religion in Hungary, but it's not as dominant as it would be in Poland, because there are large Protestant minorities and there are also others. So the question is to what extent they have contributed ideologically to the anti-socialism and individualism that you encounter. Obviously, there's a Durkheimian horizon here as well, to do with the relationship between individual and community. So, and I was just wondering, is Poland a contrasting case regarding society and economy?
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a great question, and religion is extremely important in both Hungary and Poland. Poland is my first postdoctoral project, and I went there primarily to find a case that would enable me to understand the Hungarian, as I saw it then, the relative success of Hungarian modernization of the rural sector, the recovery of an economically backward periphery of Europe in the guise of socialist modernization. None of that was happening in Poland. And that, in my argument, was it turned above all on the failure of the Polish socialist government to implement collectivization in any recognizable form after the political disasters of 1956. So there was a big difference between the way people were living in Hungary and in Poland in the last decades of socialism. But your question turns on religion. And here it's a little bit more complicated. Hungary, it's roughly 2/3 Catholic, 1/3 Reformed Church, Calvinist tradition, and both churches were present in the village that I studied. And yes, I think it's fair to say that Christian values infuse rural life much more strongly than they do life in the cities. They affect the way the nation is perceived. This is true in both Hungary and Poland, although, of course, the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church is so much greater in the Polish case. As far as attitudes to the land and to ownership are concerned, I do not see a great distinction. The attachment to private property, to small holding peasantry, lots of the old style populists, the populists known as narodniki in Russian, and they had their followers in most Eastern European countries before those countries became socialist. They were very committed to more or less egalitarian forms of peasant smallholding, ownership, and yes, going to church on a Sunday was part of that worldview, but it was not central to it and not central to the contrasts that I ended up analyzing between Hungary and Poland. Those contrasts had political and economic causes, not religious ones.
Well, thank you very much. Peter Skalnick would like to ask you about your nomenclature. You do talk about this in your introduction as to why you have preferred to use socialist and not communist. Because Peter also says, well, given that communism was a dictatorship, I mean, it might be actually relevant to use the term. So, as it were, you know, call a spade, perhaps might help us understand the ethnography better. I don't know how you would interpret that.
Well, Peter has asked me this question, I think, every other year for about 40 years, as long as I've known him. And I'm afraid we will never agree on this. It does relate back to the point I made earlier about my own view of these systems being somewhat different from the view of the people that I'm studying. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Peter Skalnick, distinguished anthropologist, scholar of so many topics where he has expertise that I shall never ever match. But when it gets down to it, he is a native of these countries who cannot forgive the communists, let me call them communists, for what they did to his country over many decades. And the fact that they actually called themselves socialist regimes, by the time I went there as a foreign anthropologist to study them, I'm following that logic. And in the comparative literature, at least in anthropology, it is the term socialism that has predominated. So here I am siding with the comparativists, the analytic social science tradition, and admittedly doing some violence to the way that people in the village pub, as well as in the academy in Prague and Katowice, they will prefer to refer to this regime in a pejorative way as communist. Yeah, you can have the same argument about many terms. Some people are still trying to use populist as an analytic term, although it tends to be used in rather different ways in everyday speech. I don't have a solution to this, but and I do sometimes use communist in publications, but generally socialist because of the literature that's out there. My wish to engage with that, to respect what the regime said about themselves, and to leave open the possibility, at least, that their imagination of a communist future was something that we might wish to expect and even take seriously. So for all of those reasons, I am not going to change my mind about that. And Peter and I will continue to disagree.
Well, in that case, let's not get too far off Polanyi, because I'm anxious to go to areas where we might. I've got, of course, lots of questions. If I can just slip one in. Of course, Chris, you were also an ethnographer of Turkey. But isn't that a rather different setting from the Eastern European countries that you're applying to Polanyi? So if you had to apply Polanyi to Turkey, how would that change, as it were, the possible application of his ideas?
Well, it's a very good question. Thank you, David. I don't think I have ever tried to operationalize Polanyian concepts in the context of Turkey, although I did spend more or less 2 years in that country with Ildiko Belirhan. We published a book about the Black Sea, which you're familiar with. It would not be too difficult to revisit that book, which explores the modifications of a very statist, that was the word that Ataturk liked to use. Polanyi would say that's clearly highly redistributive. It's not socialist central planning, but it's a very strong state. There is a lot of redistribution going on, and the market element is being confined. From the 1980s onwards, we know that the space for a market logic was increasing in Turkey at much the same time that Reagan and Thatcher spoke about the virtues of spontaneous market solutions to increase growth rates, etc. Özal and his followers were doing the same in Turkey. And so I don't think it would be difficult to apply a Polanyian framework in that limited sense, even if, of course, we are not talking about collectivization, where the land is taken into collective ownership. That kind of thing did not happen. But in very general terms, the Polanyian message about embedded economies and disembedding when a market principle is allowed a little too much scope, I think you could see examples of that disembedding in many corners of contemporary Turkey. But I've not done fieldwork there in the present century, so you are much more competent to assess that than I am.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Thank you very much. But we have another question here. Please do keep sending your questions in, colleagues. It's fascinating. So Pablo would like to ask, how can Polanyi help us think through the challenges of climate change? Can he be a thinker for the Anthropocene?
Well, thanks for this question too. I said very little about ecological dimensions, climate change, in the book that we're talking about today. And I've been rebuked for that very properly. A review that came out very recently by an area specialist, by Mary Taylor, in the Anthropology of East Europe review, correctly comments that there is an awful lot going on in Polanyian studies, if I can use that phrase nowadays, which I don't even touch on. And work on climate change is just one of, perhaps the most important of those themes. Let me mention the name of Mark Harvey, a sociologist who has done a great deal to apply a Polanyian framework to Amazonian case materials. He looks at what is happening in our fragile Anthropocene and believes that Karl Polanyi has the theoretical answers, starting from that key notion that land is a fictitious commodity, that the environment, he defines economy in terms of the human's place in an environment. And from those very programmatic indications in the 1950s essays, it's not too difficult for Polanyi's message to find many followers among ecological activists, anti-globalization movements. There is an international Polanyi center based in Vienna, which you can find very easily in the internet, which is organizing seminars right now, this week, on precisely these themes. Why Polanyi is the key theorist to understand how humans are destroying their environment. I think Alf Hornborg also has a book coming out very soon, which covers similar ground, also acknowledging a debt to Polanyi, I think. There is an institute that bears Polanyi's name in Montreal at Concordia University, where in addition to other themes, the environmental one is very prominent. So you can look up the Polanyi Institute for Political Economy at Concordia University in Montreal, the center in Vienna, and there is also a LUSA network in Budapest. And if you look up all of these centers inside academic homes and look at the work that is going on under the general banner of Polanyi, you'll see many examples of how this approach can be made useful in addressing urgent, burning issues. That's the best I can say at the moment, I think. Mark Harvey is the book I would go to. Very recent book, you can find it very easily, I'm sure.
I interject a quick question.
Go ahead, James, go ahead.
Referring to Polanyi and the Amazon and all of that. And this is, I'm not trying to be argumentative. How is this materially different from, say, a critique of capitalism? If the clear felling of the Amazon is to feed American pigs and to make various merchants in Brazil rich, how is this materially different from a critique of capitalism?
Well, it's not materially different, James. It flows into it. It is the cutting edge of that critique, and it is moving away from an older style of critique of capitalism that focused on industrial factories and the exploitation and the transfer of value. These are propositions in the Marxist corpus, which we may still respect, but which seem, in some ways at least, to be passé in the kind of digital world that we inhabit today. And for this reason, the scholars of capitalism, let me name another one, Wolfgang Streeck, a good friend in Germany, writing about European societies, and finding Polanyi more helpful than Marx to grapple with not just the global south and the problems of environmental destruction in remote places, but with what is happening in his own Germany today. So it's not an alternative, it's to be grafted on to earlier styles of critique of capitalism.
That answers my question, thank you.
Any more questions, then please do send them in. Peter, I get your objection, Peter, and I don't think that I'm wanting not to let you speak. But I really think that the seminar today is about Polanyi and his application to Eastern Europe. Perhaps we can have another debate about the nomenclature of communism. But one thing strikes me, because of course, is the Viennese background. I mean, Popper, of course, equally was brought up in Vienna at that time. Is there anything we can say about relations between Popper and Polanyi that would be at all interesting, I wonder, for our viewers?
That's a very interesting question, David, and I'm not an expert, of course. Yes, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in its heyday threw up some very interesting schools of thought, and I'm quite sure that Popper, like Malinowski, like Polanyi, they all read a guy called Ernst Mach, who I'm afraid I have never read, but I think I know roughly where he is coming from philosophically, what he stands for in the decades before the First World War. Yes, there are common sources, but I think no cross-fertilization, at least in the case of Popper and Polanyi. Did they interact? Did they ever meet at maybe some social circle among Christian socialists in London in the 1930s? It's not inconceivable from what I know of Polanyi's biography, although Popper might have been off to New Zealand by then. It's possible. In terms of political orientation, there's no doubt that they were poles apart. Popper is much closer to a liberal conservative of the Hayek persuasion, and Mises before him. These are the politics, incidentally, of Karl Polanyi's younger brother, Michael, 10 years younger and very well known as a philosopher, of course. Michael and Karl Polanyi were very close as brothers, but they were diametrically opposed politically, intellectually. Oh, let's not get into a debate about Habsburg genealogies. Then we'd have to come to Ernest Gellner, who isn't quite born in the Habsburg era, but is in some sense a late echo of those debates in his own loyalties to Popper. But he was always interested in my interest in Polanyi because the theories were grounded in that part of the world where he came from, and he wanted to make sense of it. So I won't say that Gellner ever embraced Polanyi's socialist politics, far from it, but he was genuinely interested and respectful, I would say.
Indeed. I'm sure he was. Any more questions? Please fire them in. I don't wish for a moment to let my questions take priority over everybody else's. So just put your hand up or ask, or if James, if you want to say anything, just drop in. Please do. But you were talking about migration, Chris, which clearly is an absolutely crucial issue here. And just like Thomas, I'm not an expert in the area, but I have started looking at Bulgaria a bit. And the sheer sadness and desolation of the Bulgarian villages really makes one very, very sad, even the small towns. But the problem here is where's the causality? Who can stop? Who can make migration? I've also been studying Paul Stirling's articles again recently, and Paul makes the very interesting point, of course, your predecessor at Kent, that you can't have modernity without mass migration. He's absolutely clear about that. He thinks there's a causal effect, that the early attempts of the Republic to do modernization with roughly the same demographic pattern would always have been doomed to failure. So he doesn't actually see migration as an outcome of neoliberalism, but rather what happens if you try and transform your society using any model from a rural to an industrial base. So I'm not quite, well, I'd be very interested to hear your comments about that, because I have no answer. That's as far as I've reached.
Well, I don't have an answer. We know that Polanyi was a migrant himself. We can only speculate on what he might think about politics of migration in Hungary at the moment. And for those of you not aware of the situation, I was there just a week ago, and it's still a live issue. You still have regular TV coverage of the soldiers, the police patrolling that horrible fence to the south of Hungary, quite close to my field site. It's very hard to imagine Polanyi feeling comfortable about Fortress Europe. On the other hand, it's also hard to imagine Polanyi sympathizing with ultra-globalist cosmopolitans who believe that we can move speedily to a world without borders, in which labor is moved around as a commodity to fill the gap, ever-intensifying speed of mobilities. My successor in Halle, I think, is doing very interesting work on global mobilities. That's Biao Xiang. And I think he finds Polanyi interesting for the work that he is doing, but I'm not going to quote you chapter and verse because I can't. I'm afraid that on some points, Polanyi might come close to sympathizing with ideals that are associated with with the bad guys in contemporary Hungarian politics. I mean, my friends, at least in the capital city, they are, of course, liberals who have the same liberal values that prevail in our academy. But whether Polanyi would go all the way with some of our colleague liberals in terms of post-colonial theories and what is now de rigueur, even for the left parties. Die Linke in Germany has lost a lot of its support with the former East German working class because of the party's leaders' committed support for opening borders and welcoming migrants, in full knowledge of the fact that this does have consequences for the lower segments of the labor market inside Germany. These are very difficult issues, and Polanyi had a long phase where his moralism was explicitly Christian. I think Christianity dropped away at the end to a residual socialist commitment. He believed that socialism will resolve these problems, and he might have been willing to call it communism. I'm not sure. Socialism is the word I think he uses more frequently. But I don't have easy answers any more than you do. And the Turkish case is certainly a very interesting one to bring up for comparison.
Well, thank you very much. James, do you want to add anything here about these kind of things, migration, neoliberalism?
Just that we've been here we've been in this, collectively have been in this conversation for a while. Jonathan Friedman does not particularly like the flyover liberals who looked with his, the flyover view of the world where there is no place. If people have places and you have something that looks kind of like borders, and I don't mean fences with armed guards, but a sense that here is different from there. And if that's the case, why shouldn't people be expected at least to conform, if not to stay in one place? If they're going to, why shouldn't people be expected to accommodate if they move? That's a very Baudelarized and shortened version of Jonathan Friedman's argument, but it makes sense to me. That doesn't mean it's appealing, but it makes sense.
Yeah, these are difficult matters, aren't they? It's not appetizing at all. I have been authoritatively informed by people who used to be very close to Jonathan, and I have the highest regard for his work. And most recent book, where he touches on the problems that he has had with the more politically correct in the academy, it's worth reading. But his earlier work is the best that I'm aware of by a card-carrying anthropologist on those long-term issues of human evolution that I touch upon at the very end of my book, but we didn't get into those today, and we can't. I think Jonathan Friedman is a very serious and distinguished scholar. And the fact that he's been virtually excommunicated from anthropological communities seems to me extremely regrettable. We should be having these debates, and we should not be afraid to debate these sensitive matters.
But we are.
I'm not in this book. This book is not about those topics. Maybe if I feel brave, I will try and wade in there. But you have to be very brave to challenge the orthodoxies that Friedman has railed against in recent years.
Well, thank you. And please, Thomas, do just raise your hand. Please do make your comment live. Could we, Hanine, perhaps felicitate Thomas rejoining us?
Yeah, I think he can still unmute, actually. Let's see.
Unmute, and
Yes.
I'll just switch to my other. Yes, so I have a.
Chris, you and I have been discussing this for many years, the relationship between class politics and identity politics, and the dilemmas that arise from the tension between what you could call a cosmopolitan, or what some would call a globalist attitude, and a more national or nationalist attitude in politics. And this seems to me to be one of the main ideological tension almost everywhere in the world, if you care to look now. So is there a third way, as I'm saying in the Q&A, which could save the political left and lead to reconciliation between the globalists and the nationalists in a progressive leftist project? I know it's a tall order, but these are things that both you and I have been thinking a lot about for many years.
Thank you, Thomas. It's very good of you to throw this in. Hungary actually has quite a rich tradition of theorizing a third way. I mean, long before Tony Blair, one of their most distinguished historians, he was a lawyer by training, István Bibó, was a political actor in 1956, and he paid for his actions in 1956 with several years of imprisonment before an amnesty, and then pensioned off to a library, and never achieved scholarly recognition in his lifetime, died in 1979. But his work has been rediscovered and justifiably feted by Hungarian intellectuals since the late socialist period. He wasn't at that time tangling with that binary that you gave us just now, class analysis and identity politics. I suppose you could say it was there implicitly. My view is that Jonathan Friedman offers us an interesting approach to understand why that dilemma, why that binary has become so salient in the contemporary world. And that's why Friedman would have a place on my reading lists for economic anthropology courses. It is just terribly sad, and you know the story better than I do from your Scandinavian perspective. I'm not sure if he's ever uttered anything about Norwegian politics, and I'm certainly not qualified to do so, but he has been interpreted as expressing sympathy for the Swedish Democrats, who are now the largest party in Sweden following the recent elections, and we know that they have Nazi origins, and so it all gets terribly delicate and embarrassing. I think that's what James was alluding to as well. I follow these debates also in Britain, where I live, as well as Hungary, where I do my research. And I am impressed by the similarities between these cleavages. Everywhere I see them documented, even in Scandinavia, which is still a bastion of old-fashioned social democracy for most of us, even if it's a little bit weaker now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. So I'm told, in the case of Sweden, at least. Thank you for the comment. And let's try and get back to third way theorizing. If you have any inspiration, please let me know. We need to do better than Tony Blair, that's for sure.
I want to put a question about this question. The way the question is framed, at least in print on the screen, is these alternatives of cosmopolitan and socialism, nationalism, and the tension between them. And what the question does not address is, why do people find either one attractive? And I work on a kind of a very simple model, is that look for what people are afraid of. And to quote from Chris Hann, you invoke at one of your quotes materialism, people's material circumstances. Are people nationalist because they're feeling threatened materially, which is something that governments should be able to deal with if they want to? So not what is the attraction of, say, nationalism, but what is the fear that makes nationalism attractive? You see the distinction between the two questions. And you could say the same with cosmopolitanism.
Absolutely. And you can, thanks a lot, James, and absolutely. And you can also make, you can, as many do, you can look at this through the lens of class as well. And you would also see that there's a very clear class division between those potentially left-leaning people who are nationalists and those ostensibly left-leaning people who are cosmopolitans. I mean, they represent different material interests. So you have to, quite clearly, you have to start there in order to try to untangle this Gordian knot. Yes.
As an ethnographer, I try to look for answers in what people tell me, in people's grave dismay, misery, when they don't see their children for years on end, because even if the flights back from England to Hungary are very cheap, it's not actually very easy for their kids to get back, for them to organize life cycle rituals as used to be organized in villages and small towns. Their family lives have been so profoundly affected by the dislocation of the last 3 decades. I don't think it's too simplistic to say that the higher temperatures in terms of national sentiment exploited by unscrupulous politicians. It's just a very easy field to mobilize those sentiments given what is happening to families. Yeah, when you can't find a worthwhile job, when your only choice is, you could commute for an hour from the town that I'm studying to work for above average wages by Hungarian standards in a Mercedes factory, but still only be paid 1/3 of what a worker is paid in Stuttgart for doing the same work. I document this in chapter 11. That gives rise to frustration. And when Viktor Orban plays on anti-Brussels and anti-Berlin emotions, it's just too easy for him to do that because of the underlying political, economic inequalities. They are there, they have consequences for the human communities that we are studying, the human beings that we are studying.
Thank you.
But I'd like to just take the opportunity of thanking Ildiko Christoph. I see a long comment in chat, which I can't answer properly now, certainly not in written form, but she makes the point that, yes, of course, there are differences between the Protestants and the Catholics over the centuries. And I support that completely. I would need to see the evidence to be certain that the Calvinists are stronger supporters of Fidesz, just because Orban himself has that background. She doesn't mention that, and that's surely not playing a role. I don't see any difference nowadays because the Hungarian countryside is so overwhelmingly for Fidesz, whether Catholic or Protestant is dominant locally. But thank you very much for that point. There are, of course, differences historically between those two major churches. And some of the smaller ones as well. The Lutheran Church is also present in the situations that I'm looking at concretely. Thank you.
James, I'm seeing there's also another question in the Q&A. Should we maybe look at that? It's been an anonymous attendee, and it says, is there a Polanyi perspective that reconciles both the globalist and nationalistic perspectives in third way approaches to modern social problems? Thank you. Maybe we already got to that, actually. Sorry.
Chris, you're much more of a Polanyi specialist. I've only read The Great Transformation 3 times, so I'm not sure I'm fit to answer.
No, I'm not going to try to answer that one. Polanyi, as I said, is extremely popular with the alter globalization movements, and he has some very interesting work in the wake of the Second World War on the need to build regional blocks, so you can draw on him for theorizing alliances, solidarities at that kind of level. Ultimately, yes, global solidarity, that's what we need. But I don't think myself Polanyi solves those questions. I'm very happy that there is so much interest in his work in this neoliberal era. But I think a very long time ago, I agreed with one of my closest friends in Budapest, with the economic anthropologist Mihály Sárkány, that Polanyi, great distinguished scholar though he is, does not actually have all the answers. Now, Mihály said that to me in socialist days, around about the time of the rediscovery of Polanyi, the centenary of his birth. So that was before the end of socialism, before the impact of an accelerated globalization in this century. But I don't think Mihály would take a different view today, and I would take that view, that he is good to think with, but you cannot expect definitive answers. In his own work, it's worth looking at all the work that he's inspiring these days. I mentioned a few people like Mark Harvey and Alf Hornborg to help us to find more answers.
Can I?
And of course, Thomas Hilland Eriksson. Let's not leave Thomas out of this. I'm so glad he's here this afternoon. Read Thomas Eriksson.
With his sunglasses up there. I want to go back to this anonymous attendee's question. And we get an opposition of, and we've been talking about an opposition between globalist and nationalist perspectives. I guess the question I want to know is, does globalism imply a global uniformity? Or does it imply a, I don't know, global acceptance, which is different from uniformity, or a global integration in a sense of different sets of people doing different sets of Durkheimian division of labor, if you will. Does nationalism require does nationalism require hating your neighbor, which is sort of implicit? Or can you have a nationalism of we are this and we do this well and we interact with other sets of people elsewhere in a reasonably orderly and civilized way? Why do these perspectives, why do they have to be emotional and argumentative? And why do we assume that there is in globalism this is the complaint on the American right, is the liberal elites on the coast, we globalists, want us all to be like them. And if we're not like them, they punish us. The nationalist, my country, Chauvin, my country right or wrong. Why does globalism have to imply uniformity? Or why is globalism seen to imply uniformity? And why is nationalism seen to imply animosity? Because they don't have to. It's not logically. They may empirically, which is a different question.
Mm-hmm.
I see a Thomas Hill and
Big questions. Let me just briefly get back to Polanyi again to fill in biographical details for those of you who are not familiar with the story. I mean, in some sense, it's a tragic story. I mentioned the fact that his background is Jewish, but at the same time, he's extremely committed to the language and the country where he grew up. He's bilingual, of course. He's brought up with German and English as well. He's a cosmopolitan, if you like, but one who spent the last years of his life with his wife translating populist poetry for a North American audience, so that key works from the great Hungarian plain where I do my fieldwork, or evoking folk traditions of that region, that they could be made available to wider audiences. So that's to give an indication of the man himself. Of course, he was respecting cultural differences. For quite a long time, in his early years, he was influenced by a politician called Oskar Jászai, almost certainly also of Jewish background, with strong ideas about bringing the nations of the Danube region, the entire Carpathian Danube region, should come together in some form of federal, of course, peaceful political entity. You can look at those texts and say, well, of course they said that, but they still expected the Hungarians to be dominant somehow. Were they really egalitarian in recognizing every smaller nation as morally the equivalent of the Hungarians, the Magyars? That's when it gets complicated. But the awkward point that I will stress here, even though this is public, an event that's being recorded, Polanyi's Jewishness was definitely an element that made his persona restricted his appeal in certain circumstances, certain circles, because for some people that he interacted with at home and in the diaspora, he may well have identified very strongly with his country and his culture, but his culture was also from birth a Jewish one that many Hungarians to this very day have their suspicions towards. It is harder to be a Jew in today's Hungary, even though I'm not suggesting for one moment that Viktor Orbán himself personally encourages anti-Semitism. He leaves that to other elements in his party. These elements, these machinations are going on all the time, and that is how you might bring the person of Karl Polanyi into play here. Like Marcel Mauss, his Jewishness in a full biography, it has to be taken into account, unfortunately. So, but Thomas, you wanted to come in, please comment.
Yes, just very briefly. Thanks very much, Chris. Yes, and I mean, you haven't even mentioned George Soros, who's low-hanging fruit in this context. So I think, I mean, just to comment very briefly on what James is saying is that I think we should analyze very carefully which phenomena are being scaled up and which are being scaled down. We cannot expect, as Chris says, Polanyi to give answers to questions that we're now raising in an era of accelerated neoliberal globalization, you know, the era of the smartphone and the container ship, which is a different world. But there are certain enduring insights to do with the relationship between market and society, for example, which we can apply in order to understand some of the ideological upheavals that we're seeing today, from the United States to India, you know, from Sweden to Hungary, and which, as Chris says, have many pattern resemblances, have many of the same causes. So what has happened one of the things that's happened since Polanyi's Great Transformation was published in 1944 is runaway accelerated globalization, but also the weakening eventually of multilateralism, the weakening of institutions like the United Nations, which could have actually set on the brakes, which could have been a regulatory instance, not least when it comes to climate justice and these kinds of issues, but it's not. So perhaps what has been scaled up is the economy. What has been scaled down is the global conversation. And what if we imagine a world in which it were all opposite? You scale down the economy, you regain control of your economy, and you're not being overrun by global forces and by huge corporations, whether they're Chinese or they call Amazon and Apple, but where the global conversation is allowed to flourish, which is the opposite of what we've been seeing in recent years. So my analytical point is that let's distinguish between different aspects of withdrawal, expansion, openness, closure, globalization, localism, because they come in many flavors, and they can be left and they can be right. Don't you agree?
Yes, I think I agree. But you need to be very careful, Thomas, because although you're using very different language here, when you talk about the economy and bringing it somehow under control, embedding it, to use the standard Polanyian metaphor. I haven't seen the metaphor of embeddedness in a Viktor Orban speech, but that's the kind of thing that he is preaching. We have to welcome Mercedes and other multinational companies, and we welcome the Chinese. The Chinese are currently reconstructing the railway line that goes through the town that I'm studying. It's part of their new Silk Road, Belt and Road project. So the West and the East, the big players, are involved in little Hungary. And here is Viktor Orban railing his arms and saying, we must bring this under control, and taking populist measures that go some way to at least convincing his electorate that he is bringing things under control, while in practice, it's very dubious whether he's controlling anything, but just opening the gates to increased international exploitation. It's very tricky ground, but yes, Thomas, I think I'm with you, and we should be exploring those issues in more depth. Thank you.
Do you want to try that last one, Chris? The last question and answer?
The last question and answer, is that the last question that I see is a long one about, no, there is something else.
Would the works of Polanyi, of Polanyi provide or an outline or indication? Do you see that one? The societies of the Danube,
yes,
could create national feeling while embracing newer elements of immigration as a positive development.
Societies of the Danube, that's what I was touching on just now with reference to the work of Yassi. I'm afraid we're a long way away from any such harmonious solution. There are too many tensions between those neighbors, and despite several years of cooperation in the framework of the Visegrád agreement, it used to be 3 partners, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, and then Czechoslovakia split. So there are 4 members that have been meeting regularly and trying to find common ground, issues that unite them in the context of the European Union, of which they've all been members since 2004. But even within those 4 close neighbors in East Central Europe, it's not always easy to find that common ground. And when you look at other neighbors further down into the Balkans, it gets more problematic again. The fact is that some of the nations in Eastern Europe, Poles and Hungarians, have a history of imperialism. I think we can call it that. They tried to assimilate neighboring peoples, that's to say, people who spoke a different language, might have had another religion that wasn't either the dominant Roman Catholic or the Protestant tradition that most Magyars follow. There are tense relationships, and they need to be borne into account when you hear Viktor Orban get involved in the debates about migration, as he did once again this summer with some notorious remarks to an audience in Transylvania, a Hungarian audience, but deep inside the Romanian state, where he said basically, it's all very fine for us to mix with the peoples of this, I don't think it was the Danube region, but this region of Central Europe, the Carpathian Basin. And he used language that was reminiscent of 19th century racial analysis. Racial intermixing is okay, but he draws a line at the intermixing that would admit Syrians or Afghans Muslims in general, that's a very strong element in the Orban rhetoric in recent years. But it's clear that popular conceptions of what race is feed into the rhetoric of his party, and there is really no sign of a liberal, of a more tolerant Hungarian society emerging, as I see things at the moment, in the places where I do my work. I think that will only happen when their own material dilemmas do not take the form they take today. In other words, when young families can build a future comfortably inside Hungary, when the pressures of neoliberal globalization are not having the consequences, the pernicious, unequal consequences that they have on that population today, then we might expect, because Hungarians are no different from other people, they're no different from the people I grew up with in South Wales or the people I know in Eastern Cambridge. When it comes down to it, they will behave more decently when they have a more decent society to live in. And what disturbs so many of us at the moment is a consequence of the political economy of our age. That's the way I see it.
Fair enough. Can I then go back to the question that I put to you in my 10 minutes? Why do we avoid either? Why do we tend to avoid, if we should have both an attention to particularities and to broader frames or issues, why do we seem to embrace one or the other so much? And why do particularists become resolute particularists and generalists become resolute generalists? And no one ever says what you laid out in that book, it seems to me fairly clearly, is we need both. Why is it so difficult to do that, to have both?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with your premise. Is it so difficult? We've been talking with Thomas Hilland Eriksson, who is a shining example of how you can have the big ideas, and using the language of scale now, he is reminding us. But
And how many Thomas Hilland Erikssons are there in the world?
no, we don't have enough, but he's cornered the textbook market. I hope that is the kind of anthropology that we are teaching our students. I'm not teaching right now, and you're not either, I think, James. So perhaps we're not going to be doing this ourselves. But if you found my book to be a productive combination of ideas, drawing particularly on Polanyi's ideas, abstractions, and the concrete, the nitty-gritty, as I was calling it, then I'm very pleased that one reader has come away with something that that was indeed my goal, and that is what I think we should pay attention to in general. So we are in full agreement here, maybe not in full agreement as to the number of colleagues around the world who still, in their different ways, I mean, the particularists, as you are pejoratively dismissing them, surely most of those, most of them,
that is a pejorative term.
It sounded a bit pejorative to me.
The devil is in the details. That's a positive glance on particularism.
I am impressed by how many scholars who, if I criticized them in earlier years for being excessively particularist, I'm thinking of my good friend Stephen Goodman here, but when I look more closely and look at his recent work, he's actually putting forward quite general models with his vocabulary of community and base and market. Yeah. And although he may not always invoke Polanyi, where I think Polanyi might be invoked, Stephen's work would be one that I would like to add to our limited canon in economic anthropology. Just to throw in another name of a distinguished colleague who I've been lucky enough to work with. So not so few people, and I hope our work, the work of people who combine the abstract and the particular in the way that you two encourage and approve of, James, I think that is the future for our field.
I hope you are correct. Do we wrap it up 6 minutes early?
Yeah, I was just thinking with the time left, there's only enough space for a small question or for a last comment, for example.
Your man, Chris, go for it.
No, James, I've talked too much, and I would just like to reassure the audience, the 30 or so who are still there. The book is not really about the questions we've been debating in the last half hour. The book has a few nice photographs. I would recommend the experience of publishing with Central European University Press, even if they don't have a big anthropology list for anybody doing work on that region. It was a pleasure to work with them. If I have contributed a little bit to keeping the name of Polanyi alive in our circles, then I must be satisfied. I believe I haven't mentioned many names. I deliberately wanted to avoid lists of names, but I was at a conference recently that focused on the work of Eric Wolf. And although Wolf in his best known works does not cite Polanyi very often, here is another very distinguished anthropologist who would never have been labeled, he's an economic anthropologist. We don't need to worry about the labels here, but the substantive achievements of Eric Wolf, in particular his big history book, Europe and the People Without History. I think the vision that he develops and the way in which he wants to embed economic phenomena, of course, he's coming from his own neo-Marxist perspective, but I find it very compatible with the Polanyian thrust. And so, yeah, I just blurted one more name out. It should not be too difficult to teach our students that there are alternatives to the dominant, the mainstream, the neoclassical economic arguments that have just toppled another government in this country on the day that we have this seminar. I will leave it at that for today.
I'm talked out, so.
Last comment from you, James, or?
I have shot my bolt. Such as it was.
Okay, so then I think it's a good time to wrap it up and let everybody go home, maybe look at the TV or not, and have a good evening or good rest of your day. And I want to say thank you to Chris for presenting your book here, and thank you to James for joining us and discussing it. It was a really rich discussion, and yeah, thank you. And
thank you for setting this up.